Okay, we now come to the second part of today's meetup. And for that, we have our very own Hervé. So, Hervé is the Prisma's Vice President of Product. And today he'll be talking about the future of Prisma and its roadmap. So, a little bit about Hervé. Hervé's background is as an engineer, and he's worked previously at Google and Contentful. So now I bring you to the stage. Hervé, welcome, Hervé. It's nice to have
Hi.
you.
Hi, Danielle. Hi, everyone. Happy to be here. All
So
right.
you ready?
Yeah, always happy to start.
Okay, so I'll put your slide up on the screen
There we
and
go.
remove that.
Brilliant. Okay, so let's get started. Let's go through a little bit of an agenda. So as Daniel said, I'm leading product at Prisma. You can find me on Twitter. I'm randomly joining there, and also on GitHub. Where I keep tabs on what's going on as well. And so today I want to talk a little bit more about our mission at Prisma. What are we there to achieve? How do we break down this mission into some focus areas that we use to inform how we tackle our work? I'll brush through the last 3 months worth of changes on the Prisma front, so you kind of know what's been going on, and then close with what's upcoming. So the treats part of the Halloween trick or treats, I guess. So yeah, let's get started. Our mission is pretty simple. We just want to make databases easier to work with as a software developer. We know databases are complicated, and this is really something we strive for, making simpler to work with. And we really want to look at that holistically and not just through the current solutions we have, but really try to look at that and what kind of solutions can we put together and eventually offer, so that eventually you really focus on what you love doing the most, which is building apps. Um, right now, our focus areas are threefold. We want to enable developers first to make the most out of their data infrastructure. You want to be able to use the databases that you have at hand, the ones you know about, and you want to interact with them through an API that's easy to use, that's type safe, that gives you confidence and productivity in general. So this is where we would typically work on the client features, adding new connectors so you can support a multitude of different databases, so that eventually you can really make the most out of them. The second aspect is managing changes to the data model, the schemas, without hassle. This is one part that can be quite scary to do, especially on production. Changing schemas of your database is like leading to potential data losses or downtime, and so really want to make that process smooth, reliable, and easy to work with too. And finally, the one that we also look at is just feeling productive in your environment. So not just feeling productive when it comes to building the pieces of the app talking to the database, but as a whole, like looking at the stack that you're using, so that Prisma can be an integral part of it, but also the toolkits you're using, the development environment you're in, and making that really nice and fluid to work with Prisma. So I'm using these three areas to break down the kind of work we're doing. So you'll see these colors coming up in the deck a little bit. So let's go through recent changes. Last 3 months have been quite busy, um, and the first pillar is what I'm going to talk about first. We introduced a bunch of different API changes so that you essentially have less and less to rely on raw SQL to make some of the operations you would otherwise do. Um, we had some gaps there that we continuously filling. One of them was distinct, being able to do distinct queries, aggregations, ordering by multiple columns. We also recently introduced a find first method, which was kind of a limitation of our find one and find many methods. So we're trying to really make that easier to just work with and being more productive querying. We also work with operations to handle transactional use cases. The atomic number operations was one part of that, so making it easier to just make changes in an atomic way without having to lean on complex transactions. We also introduced in preview multiple API signatures like connect or create or transaction to just manage transactional operation, either through nested writes or just as a sequence of operations you want to run within a transaction. Another one that I'm particularly a fan of is really instrumentation using middlewares. So we have this use method that you can use to define hooks in your code so that you can change the way or instrument your code base that takes every single Prisma call that you can wrap and just observe and potentially change the call itself. So that allows you to do things like measuring the time difference between the beginning and the end of a call. You can transform like a delete into an actual soft delete. So instead of actually deleting, updating a flag in the database. So that really gives you a lot of superpowers when it comes to dealing with your code base. Very new, actually, as of yesterday, we introduced a new connector in preview, which is Microsoft SQL Server, that supports currently the introspection workflow and the Prisma client. And there's a bunch of caveats. So this is a preview feature, and preview features at Prisma means that we you can count on them. They do have some known issues. They may have some edge cases and bugs that we didn't fully cover yet, and we're actively working on fixing them and bringing these preview features to GA. Migrate is not supported yet. That means you still have to deal with the schema directly. But there's a lot of users who already have SQL Server databases and could use a Prisma client to work with them in TypeScript. Looking at managing schema changes, two big things that we've worked on the last 3 months. One was reintrospection and introspection together are now one. You can really make changes and keep your Prisma schema up to date with the changes that are happening on the database level. So that's typically when you're working within teams where the database is shared and some changes can be done by other teams, and you want to make sure your Prisma schema is kept up to date. You can just reintrospect and make sure that everything is really up to date. The other one that we just introduced yesterday in preview is called Prisma DB Push. That is really just about bringing your database schema to par with your Prisma schema in one single command. And that doesn't create migrations. That's really just bringing it up so that you can just straight up start working with it. It doesn't create migrations. It's mostly done for supporting prototyping use cases. And during development can be very handy. We also heard of people who want to use it just as their regular workflow because they don't necessarily need to keep tabs on migrations and go back in history of the changes they've done to their schemas. So I clearly incentivize you to look at that and try it out. We'll work on bringing that to GA also soon too. Third pillar is really making you productive. We have a VS Code plugin, and we've done some quite a lot of changes incrementally on it. One of the ones I like a lot is this rename helper, that refactor rename sort of function, so that you can easily manage and rename things in your schema. Plus a lot more improvements there. So if you're using VS Code, you should definitely make sure you have this Prisma plugin installed. Another big thing we brought to GA recently is Prisma Studio. Prisma Studio is a visual data browser so that you can easily manage the data in the database that you're currently working with. It's web browser based, so you don't really need to have anything installed beyond your Prisma project. You launch it through the CLI, and then you can just manage your data without thinking too much about the underlying complexities of the database itself. So that's about it on the recent changes. Quite a lot of things going on. So now let's talk a little bit about what's coming up. So the first introduction is these buckets. So today's today. We have some things we plan to do, which we are committing to work on. They're roughly some things we're going to work within this quarter. And there's a bucket about what we're considering doing. What we're considering doing is something we have pretty much confidence we're going to tackle. We still have like some questions, some discussions with the users, the community, some validations to run, and we may reshuffle these plans. But that's really giving you a hint at the direction we're taking. So planned, committed, considering something that you can look at to see where we're going. Um, Again, the all of the things I'm going to show, they're also not shown in a specific order, and they don't represent necessarily the complexity or the size. This is really about really giving you an overview of what we're doing. Solutions for transactional use cases. We heard a lot of feedback about long-running transactions. Specifically, we really want to make Prisma developers able to work with transactional use cases, but also adopt the best practices when it comes to working with transactions. Prisma aims at being deployed on modern data infrastructures like serverless functions. So databases there require some specific attention when it comes to the way transactions are managed. And long running transactions have a history of being problematic in lots of various situations. And there's a lot of interesting patterns out there to actually approach the problems differently. And we want to make Prisma really well suited to tackle them and offer APIs and guides and solutions and help so that everyone can just benefit from them. And so that these applications can scale and just be deployed on any kind of infrastructure you want and not being limited to maybe some internal constraints of the design pattern that transactions may have sometimes. So we're actively going to work on this soon. We also want to limit raw SQL fallbacks. Like that's something that basically defeats the purpose of having a nice type safe API. So anything that you need to fall back on raw SQL, we're going to try to limit that and provide an API for it. So that covers group by, for example, filtering on Scala arrays in Postgres, but also some iterations on our existing features. We are currently actively working on native database types. Database types are about fine tuning the way your Prisma schema, a field, is translated in terms of storage in the database. So you can really fine tune the size of strings, you can fine tune the exact type of number that you want to use. So this is really about optimizing storage on one hand and getting a bit more finer control over the database. And eventually we want to use that also to help with some validation and just in general giving a little bit more control over the details of your schema. We're going to have a preview relatively soon, either in the next release or the release after that, probably. So stay tuned. This is really one of the biggest focus at the moment. We also released Microsoft SQL Server in preview. We want to make that stable. That's essentially what this is about. So that means bringing native database types there and also implementing migrations with SQL Server. We are actively working on migrate. This is the biggest priority by far of the product and engineering team at the moment, stabilizing migrate and proposing that as part of the stable product. The current migrate has some internal, let's say, by design, some limitations when it comes to the way it behaves. And so we are taking a different approach at the moment so that we generate imperative migrations based on your schema that you can still customize and then run predictably on production. We're opening up an early access program so you can subscribe, discuss with the product team and the team who's building that, provide feedback, give it a try, see how it works. So this is really going on at the moment. We also want to, I talked about integrating within your stack and your environment. Type safety in Prisma is great, but if you're building GraphQL API, we want to make sure you can do that also in a type safe way. And that's why we invest in Nexus Schema, and we want to bring Nexus Schema to a 1.0 release, fixing some outstanding bugs, making the integration with Prisma nice and smooth eventually. So this is also a focus of the team there. We have some discovery, so this is why this bulb is out there, discovery on productivity solutions in general. So Studio is really about making you productive, building, like dealing with your data without having to worry too much about how exactly it's done under the hood. There's some other solutions we want to investigate in there without giving you so much detail. You can just reach out to us and also tell us what you think, what you're expecting. But we're going to have a stream of work in that direction and helping you dealing with understanding complex models, trying out and iterating on queries and sharing them. So things like that. Now onto the considering bucket. There's a topic that we also want to discover more about, which is the Prisma schema's modularity. When projects grow and become, like, for example, monorepo or like multiple modules, depending on multiple different parts of a schema that you eventually need to stitch together, working with Prisma can become a bit more difficult, and we want to start looking into how to make that better and easier to define. So importing multiple schema files and composing things and having more control over this in general. Cascading behavior is really a big thing as well that we want to tackle, and that touches obviously cascading delete. But in general, how do we define cascading behavior in the schema? How do we handle migrations for them? How do you query that? What's the impact on updating or deleting records using our API? So that's something we're gonna look at next too. Document databases, in particular MongoDB, has been heavily requested, and we want to start opening up that. I mentioned document databases because MongoDB is a prominent one, but we want to design Prisma so that it can possibly talk to different document databases, not just MongoDB, but also others eventually. And last but not least, extensibility and integrations. We are in a place where services, solution, frameworks, they just multiply, and it's impossible to keep tabs on and integrate with every single one of them. So what we want to do there is start opening up places where the community can contribute and integrate with their favorite tools or stacks, connectors, and whatnot with Prisma. So we can offer you a core set of functionality, and then ways for you to extend some of them so that you don't need to wait for us to build every single piece of integration on the planet. And so what the plan there would be is to start with a few core integrations and extensions so that eventually people can use them as models and figure them the ones they want to build themselves. So that's the roadmap. You have a link up there. We strive to make updates to the roadmap every other week, every 3-4 weeks in general, and we revisit the focus areas and the themes on a regular basis too. So that's where we communicate changes. But hopefully that gives you a better understanding of all of that. I will skip these ones. I just talked through them, but it's going to be in the handover material. You can read more about them. Yeah, I just want to conclude this presentation with the fact that yes, we love feedback. We want to hear from you. You're a great community. We have a lot of input and questions, ideas, and we just want to hear from them. We just want to understand what are the biggest pain points you have with the product. What are opportunities we have to solve some of these pain points, and what are the products we can build and solutions we can bring that make sense and would really make your lives easier. So for that, we have an early access program. I talked about Migrate. We're currently opening up. There's a survey you can respond, so you can be part of that program and get access to a specific package with the new Migrate. Test it out, see how it works. So yeah, feel free to scan that code or follow that link, and you'll be in touch with our product team. You can tell us everything about what you expect from Migrate. And yeah, that's it for me. Thanks, everyone.
Hervé, thank you so much for that. That was insightful, and it sounds like we have a very promising future in the months ahead for Prisma.
Yeah, I hope so.
Is there a specific thing from the roadmap that you're particularly excited about?
That's a great question. There's lots of things. I'm excited about a lot of these things, to be honest. I think like document databases and looking at how we can really look at data holistically is obviously a big one. I have a personal favorite with also extensibility. That's been something that in my previous um, experiences I've been exposed to, and I think this is really one of the ways you can really build a platform and a great community, giving lots of solutions for people to really get creative. We already have lots of super interesting projects from the community using generators like DBML generator, docs generator, Nest.js,
We also had
TypeGraphQL,
the
like this
JSON schema
JSON
generator.
schema generation. There's a lot of these things already that we can see, even if we don't officially support them. And so I'm also very excited about seeing what we can do there, so that the community can also contribute in a structured way. So yeah, these would be the ones I would call out.
Great. You ready for some questions?
Yeah.
So we had a question from Benji, who asked if there are any plans to define constraints and fields, such as validation, or is that out of scope for Prisma?
So actually, interestingly enough, we talked about that today quite a bit. In general, I wouldn't say it's out of scope for Prisma. I think validation of data that you bring into your database is essential. You want to make sure that you have sane data in your data stores. So there's eventually something you need to do about that. There's obviously lots of various places where validation occurred as business rules validation, which is something that lives usually at the application level. There's the format of the data. There is the actual just um, the type of the data itself. Like, is that a UUID, which is a string, but is that following the format of a UUID, for example? So we talk about some of these things. We're going to have a look at that topic as a whole and look at them in layers, but making sure that the design that we're looking at is leaving the door open to take more of these things. And I think combined with extensibility, we could look at eventually some things like custom validations and so on. But that's further off in the plans, unfortunately.
And so I think you touched on the topic of transactions and what we might have in the near future with optimistic concurrency control, OCC.
Yes.
We also had another question which asked to define what is a long running transaction. Do you want to take a stab at that?
Yeah, sure. So long running transaction is essentially in a process you would open a transaction, send a query, typically fetch some content. For example, submitting an order, so you get an order ID from your database. Then you would do another call, let's say to Stripe API, say, hey, this order ID has been submitted to us, and we want to charge some money for that. You do that call to the Stripe API, you get something back, and then you want to update your database again, saying, "Hey, the Stripe API came back, and now I can actually commit that result into my database." So this back and forth like leaves the transaction open, because if there's an error in between, the reflex would be I just commit once everything is been done and everything is okay, and I roll back if there's an error, let's say in the Stripe API. That is a typical, let's say, way of thinking that long running transactions come with. But the problem they come with too is that they apply locks on the tables, on the rows. They end up also keeping up a stateful connection with the database itself, that make it very hard to scale applications when you start to look at, for example, serverless functions, but also other kinds of horizontal scalable uh, systems. So what instead you try to do is group together the calls that need to happen on the database and do what we call optimistic concurrency control, which is really checking on the database to make sure that the field that you queried in the first place has still the same value, so you know nothing has tampered your data, and instead of just leaning on the transaction to do that job. Um, we'll have a much more detailed set of guides and cookbooks to explain something that I'm doing like my best to answer like vocally. I think with like an actual example, and code and approaches and documentation, it would be much easier to understand, I hope. But yeah, that's the gist of it.
I see. We also had a really interesting question coming in about if it makes even sense to develop APIs. If we can query our database with serverless functions or directly within our front end with Next. And I think this perhaps speaks to the kind of database and data access patterns that are now possible with Next, essentially with server-side rendering and static-side rendering. Suddenly we're seeing that it's possible to build apps without necessarily introducing an API. Do you have any thoughts on this topic?
Oh yeah, thoughts? Yes, of course. Yeah, that's a broad topic. I think it highly depends on the use case you have at hand. If you're building using Next, you likely would build a statically generated website, or, as you said, server-side rendering for like slightly more dynamic um, parts of the web app. But there's some cases where you really have a highly dynamic application that is, for example, a business system that you lean on. Um, which is where the querying would happen. I think we need to also be clear that if you're querying through from Next.js, you're actually querying the database during the build process, which is not necessarily exactly client side. Like you essentially do that still on a server to some degree. I mean, this the build server in that case, but not really on the front end per se. So like querying the database directly is something you do from a server, and that server is either a serverless function, it's an actual server, it's a build system. It's rare, and it's usually not advised to query, like to put queries directly on the front end. That's kind of exposing something that's pretty deep in the stack, pretty much high on your end. So yeah, I hope that covers. I think there's lots of different situations where querying database is really needed in the server. If you want to, for example, another case is um, to to combine data from multiple data sources so that you can make that available to, let's say, an application, and that's another case where you also definitely need to have access to that there.
Yeah, and on the topic of API, it's probably worth mentioning that if you're building an application that has multiple clients, like an iOS, an Android app, and a web app, that's kind of like where having an API really makes sense, as kind of like a one coherent access point from all your clients to your data.
Definitely, yep.
Um, Okay. I think one last question that I think is worth maybe touching on from Victor Iris. Is it planned to have a create many operation? I think we get that one asked quite often.
Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, we talked about this too. Oops. I'm sorry about that. I hope you can still hear me. Yeah. We talked about that. This is not necessarily something I would put on the roadmap as a block, but that's something we would be looking at. There's definitely a case for that. Right now, it's mostly relying on this raw SQL fallback, and we want to look at how do we improve this.
Great. Okay, so I think on that note, we'll wrap up the Q&A. There's still some questions, so I would really appreciate it if you could take a
Yeah,
look at those and answer in the chat.
yeah, I'll stick
Hervé,
around.
thank you so much for joining. It's really been a pleasure to have you here and to sort of be able to sort of take a step back, because we have these bi-weekly releases. This is also a quick reminder that we just released yesterday version 2.10.0 of Prisma. And besides that, it's always nice to sort of take a step back and take a look at the broader picture. So thank you for sharing that with the community.
Yeah, my pleasure.
And we hope to have you here soon.
Yeah, of course, count on it.
Okay, so in the next part, so thank you, Hervé.